Hey there, are you interested in learning about how living things change and evolve over time? Well, you're in luck because today we're talking about natural selection. But before we dive into the nitty-gritty, let's start with a definition. Natural selection is the process by which certain traits or characteristics become more or less common in a population of living organisms based on how well those traits help the organism survive and reproduce in their environment. Now, you might be wondering why this is important. Well, natural selection is one of the main driving forces behind the evolution of life on Earth. It's responsible for the incredible diversity of species we see today and helps to explain how species change and adapt over time. So whether you're a biology buff or just curious about the world around you, understanding natural selection is key to understanding how life on Earth has evolved and continues to evolve. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into this fascinating topic. First off, natural selection relies on the presence of variation within a population. This means that different individuals within a population have different traits or characteristics that can be passed down to their offspring. For example, in a population of birds, some individuals might have longer beaks while others have shorter beaks. These differences in traits are known as genetic variation and they're the foundation of natural selection. Next, we have the concept of heritability. This refers to the degree to which a trait or characteristic is passed down from parent to offspring. If a trait is highly heritable, it means that it's more likely to be passed down to the next generation. Now, let's bring these two concepts together. Natural selection occurs when certain traits or characteristics become more or less common in a population based on how well they help the organism survive and reproduce in their environment. This is known as the concept of fitness. For example, let's say there's a population of birds that live in an environment with a lot of hard seeds. The birds with longer beaks are better able to crack open the seeds and therefore have a higher fitness. As a result, they're more likely to survive and reproduce, passing their long beak trait down to their offspring. Over time, the population of birds will have more individuals with longer beaks. This is just one example of natural selection in action, but there are many other examples out there that demonstrate how living things adapt and evolve in response to changes in their environment. So that's a brief overview of how natural selection works. First up, we have fossil records. Fossils are the preserved remains or traces of ancient organisms that have been preserved in rock, sediment, or amber. By studying fossil records, we can see how species have changed and evolved over time. For example, we can see how the ancestors of modern horses were much smaller and had multiple toes, while modern horses have a single toe and are much larger. This is consistent with the concept of natural selection and helps to support the theory. Next, we have biogeography, which is the study of the distribution of species across the globe. By looking at the distribution of species, we can see how they've adapted to different environments and how they've moved and spread over time. For example, we can see how certain species of plants and animals are found only in specific regions or habitats and how they've adapted to those environments. This is also consistent with the idea of natural selection and helps to support the theory. Finally, we have comparative anatomy, which is the study of the similarities and differences between related species. By comparing the anatomy of different species, we can see how they're related and how they've evolved over time. For example, we can see how the anatomy of a bat is similar to that of a human, but also how it's adapted specifically for flight. This is yet another piece of evidence that supports the theory of natural selection. So there you have it. Those are just a few examples of the evidence for natural selection. It's important to understand that natural selection drives the diversity of life on Earth. As we learned in previous segments, natural selection occurs when certain traits or characteristics become more or less common in a population based on how well they help the organism survive and reproduce in their environment. Over time, this can lead to the evolution of new species as traits become more or less common in a population. But natural selection doesn't just drive the evolution of new species. It also plays a crucial role in the adaptation and survival of existing species. For example, let's say a population of birds is living in an environment with a lot of hard seeds. The birds with longer beaks are better able to crack open the seeds and therefore have a higher fitness. As a result, they're more likely to survive and reproduce, passing their long beak trait down to their offspring. Over time, the population of birds will have more individuals with longer beaks, and the birds with shorter beaks will become less common. This is an example of natural selection driving the adaptation of a species in response to changes in its environment. Finally, it's worth noting that diversity is important not just for the survival and success of individual species, but also for the health and stability of ecosystems as a whole. When an ecosystem has a diverse array of species, it's more resilient and able to withstand changes or disturbances. For example, if a disease wipes out one species of plant, other species may be able to fill that role and prevent the ecosystem from collapsing. So there you have it. That's a brief overview of the impact of natural selection on the diversity of life on Earth. As new evidence is gathered, theories may be modified or replaced with new ones. The theory of natural selection is no exception. One criticism of the theory of natural selection is that it can't fully explain the complexity and diversity of life on Earth. While natural selection can explain how certain traits become more or less common in a population over time, it can't fully account for the intricate ways in which living things are constructed. Another criticism is that natural selection relies on the assumption that living things are constantly struggling to survive and reproduce, which doesn't always align with observations of the natural world. For example, some species of animals engage in cooperative behaviors that don't seem to be directly related to survival or reproduction. However, these criticisms don't necessarily undermine the theory of natural selection as a whole. Scientists have developed responses to these criticisms and have continued to gather evidence that supports the theory. For example, the theory of evolution by natural selection has been supported by a wide range of evidence from fields such as paleontology, biogeography, and comparative anatomy. So there you have it. Those are just a few examples of the challenges that the theory of natural selection has faced. Despite these challenges, the theory continues to be supported by a wealth of evidence and remains a cornerstone of modern biology. We talked about some of the challenges that the theory of natural selection has faced over time. But despite these challenges, the theory of natural selection continues to be a fundamental and widely accepted idea in biology. One reason for this is that the theory of natural selection has been supported by a wealth of evidence from fields such as paleontology, biogeography, and comparative anatomy. This evidence helps to explain the evolution of living things over time and how species have adapted and changed in response to changes in their environment. Another reason is that the theory of natural selection is a fundamental part of the study of biology. It helps us to understand the mechanisms of evolution and how living things have adapted and changed over time. It also helps us to better understand the diversity of life on Earth and how species interact with one another. So there you have it. That's a brief overview of the ongoing importance of natural selection in the study of biology and the evolution of life on Earth. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about natural selection and other science topics, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We'll be back with more informative and educational content soon. Thanks for watching.